So you want to own a bomber, not a fighter, not a trainer, a 4-engine heavy bomber, the kind that carried 10 men across an ocean and came back with holes in it. And here's the thing almost nobody realizes. You can. There are private owners flying these right now, and a handful of them will sell you a seat for the price of a used laptop. Which raises the obvious question. If a machine like that costs a fortune to keep in the air, how is anyone letting the public climb aboard for a few $100s? That is the whole story, because the bomber is not like anything else in this series. A tank sits in a shed, a submarine sits at a pier, a bomber has to fly, or it stops being a bomber, and flying is the single most expensive verb in this entire business. This is the full ledger. What a heavy bomber costs to buy, what 4 engines do to your bank account, the strange federal rule that lets strangers pay to ride in a warplane, and the 2 accidents that rewrote this market for everybody left in it. Let's start with the airframe. The buy-in. Here's the number that frames everything. During the war, America built these bombers by the thousand, not hundreds, thousands. Factories turning out heavy bombers the way other factories turned out cars, around the clock, for years. Today, of that enormous fleet, fewer than 50 complete airframes survive anywhere on Earth, and of those, only a handful are actually airworthy at any given moment. Single digits. Sit with that gap. From a production run you measure in thousands, down to a flying population you can count on your fingers. Everything else about this market comes out of that one fact. So what happened to all of them? Scrapped. Almost immediately. The war ended, the fleet became surplus, and the aluminium was worth more melted than parked. Whole fields of bombers went into the furnaces within a few years. The ones that survived did so mostly by accident. A fire bomber conversion here, a research airframe there, one parked behind a hangar and forgotten. A few flown by foreign air forces for decades after everybody else had moved on. That means the surviving bombers were not preserved. They were overlooked. And the ones flying today are almost all rebuilds, dragged back from dereliction by people who spent years and fortunes doing it. Which brings us to price. And price in this market is strange, because there is barely a market at all. A flying heavy bomber, complete, airworthy, with a clean history, sits in the millions. Several million, depending on the type and the condition and how much of the original structure survives. But that is not really a price. It is a number attached to a handful of transactions between a very small group of people, most of whom are foundations and museums rather than individuals. You do not shop for a bomber. You wait for one, and you know everyone else who is waiting. And when one does move, the transaction looks nothing like a sale. There is due diligence that runs for months. Engineers crawl the airframe. Logbooks get read the way lawyers read contracts. The buyer wants to know every hour flown, every major repair, every part that is not original. Because in this world, a gap in the records is not a discount, it is a grounding. By the time money changes hands, both sides have usually known each other for years. There is a cheaper door, and it is a trap we will come back to. Project airframes. Hulks. Something pulled out of a field or a lake or a scrapyard with a data plate and a story and not much else. Those change hands for a fraction of the flying price. And then the real bill starts. Because a bomber restoration is not a car restoration. It is not even an aeroplane restoration in the way most people imagine. It is a manufacturing project. Parts that no longer exist have to be made from scratch, to original specification, with paperwork proving it. Sheet metal formed on tooling somebody has to build first. Systems rebuilt by specialists who learned the type from men who are now gone. 10 years is normal. Millions of dollars is normal. And a decent number of these projects never finish at all. So the entry price is either enormous or it is a decade of your life. That is the door. Now let's talk about what walks through it with you. What you inherit. You are not buying an aeroplane. You are adopting a maintenance program with wings. Start with the obvious thing. 4 engines. Every problem in this video multiplies by 4. 4 engines to overhaul on a schedule. 4 sets of cylinders. 4 propellers, each with its own inspection cycle. 4 times the oil, 4 times the plugs, 4 times the chance that something on a pre-flight check ends your day. A fighter has 1 engine and 1 clock. A heavy bomber has 4 clocks, all ticking at different speeds, all expensive, and none of them care what your flying calendar looks like. Then there is the airframe itself. These aircraft were built to a wartime lifespan. Nobody in the factory expected them to be flying 80 years later. The design brief was survive the mission, not survive the century, which means every hour flown today is an hour nobody engineered for, and the inspection regime reflects that. Structural inspections, corrosion checks in places you have to take panels off to reach, wing spar attention that would horrify a private pilot. And there is a paperwork layer that surprises everybody. A bomber this old flies under a special airworthiness certificate, not a normal one. That certificate comes with conditions attached, and one of those conditions governs whether you may carry passengers at all and under what terms. We will get to that rule because it is the entire revenue model of this asset class. Then there is the crew problem, which is unique to big aircraft. A fighter needs one qualified pilot. A heavy bomber needs a crew, 2 pilots minimum, and realistically, a flight engineer and support people who know the type. Those people do not come out of a normal flight school. They are trained inside the small world of Warbird operators, often over years, usually as volunteers who work day jobs and give up weekends. So your aircraft is grounded not just by weather or parts, but by whether the right humans are available that Saturday. And every year, a few of the people who know these aircraft best retire or die, and the knowledge pool shrinks a little more. The serious operations have started treating that as the actual crisis. They run apprentice programs, they film the old engineers working, they write down procedures that lived only in somebody's hands for 40 years. It is unglamorous work, and it does not sell a single ticket, but the aircraft that will still be flying in 20 years are the ones whose organizations are doing it right now. In this market, the rarest component is not a part, it is a person who knows how to fit it. Fuel deserves its own line. A 4-engine heavy bomber drinks in a way that shocks people the first time they see the number. Hundreds of gallons per hour, not per flight, per hour. Aviation fuel, at aviation prices, poured into 4 large radial engines that were designed in an era when nobody was counting. Every hour that aircraft is in the air, the fuel truck is effectively flying alongside it. So that is the inheritance. 4 engines, an 80-year-old structure, a special certificate with conditions, a crew you have to grow yourself, and a fuel burn measured by the barrel. Which raises the question everyone asks at this point: how on earth does anyone pay for this? The revenue layers. There are 4 ways a flying bomber earns, and one of them carries the entire model. Layer 1 is the big one: rides. This is the model that made flying bombers possible in the modern era. Members of the public pay to fly in the aircraft. Not a simulator, not a taxi down the runway, an actual flight in an actual heavy bomber sitting where the crew sat. Historically, these seats have run in the region of $400 to $500 a person, sometimes more depending on the operator and the position in the aircraft. Fill the seats, fly a circuit of maybe 20 or 30 minutes, land, load the next group. On a good weekend at a good location, a bomber can generate serious money doing this. And the operation behind that weekend is more organized than it looks. Slots are sold in advance online, waivers are signed at a table by the hangar. A briefer walks each group through the aircraft, where to sit, what to hold, what not to touch. Ground crew turn the aircraft around between flights like a tiny airline. Someone is watching the weather all day because a low cloud base can cancel an entire schedule and refunds do not fund engines. Behind every romantic photograph of a bomber lifting off with civilians aboard, there is a spreadsheet, a queue, and a very tired volunteer with a clipboard. But you cannot simply sell tickets on a warplane. That is where the federal rule comes in, and it is the single most important piece of regulation in this entire market. Aircraft with these special certificates are, as a baseline, not permitted to carry paying passengers. The whole category exists outside normal commercial aviation rules. So to make ride operations legal, the Aviation Authority created a specific exemption for historic aircraft. Operators apply for it, meet conditions, and are permitted to carry people who make a donation in the name of living history and public education. That exemption is the hinge the entire bomber economy swings on. Without it, the rides stop. And when the rides stop, the maintenance money stops, and a flying bomber becomes a parked bomber very quickly. Remember that. It matters later. Layer 2 is the air show circuit. Organizers pay appearance fees for a heavy bomber, because a 4-engine Warbird is a headline act that draws a crowd on its own. The aircraft flies to the show, performs, sits on static display where the public walks through it, and collects a fee plus whatever the ground tours bring in. Season runs through the warm months, and a well-booked bomber crosses the country several times in a summer, earning at every stop. Layer 3 is the tour. This is the airshow model turned into a business. The aircraft becomes a traveling exhibit, moving from airport to airport on a published schedule, selling ground tours during the day and rides in the morning and evening. Local media covers it. Veterans and families come out. The operation packs up and moves to the next town. Layer 4 is film and television, and it is smaller than people think, but it pays well when it lands. There are only a handful of flying heavy bombers on Earth, so when a production needs one, the negotiation is not exactly competitive. Underneath all 4 layers sits something that is not really a revenue line but functions like one: donations. Nearly every flying heavy bomber in the world is owned by a foundation or a nonprofit, not a private individual. And a meaningful share of the money comes from members, sponsors, and people who write checks because they want the aircraft to keep flying. The ride passenger is buying an experience, the donor is buying the aircraft's future, which tells you something important about this asset. It is not really owned in the way a car is owned. It is sustained. Listen to that again. Here is the number that decides everything, and I want to be precise about it. An overhaul on one of these large radial engines runs into the tens of thousands of dollars. Some estimates put a full overhaul on the bigger radials well into 6 figures once you include the propeller and the accessories and the labor. Now, multiply by 4. Say that again. One engine event on a heavy bomber can cost more than a house in most of America, and the aircraft has 4 of them, each on its own clock. And those clocks do not synchronize politely so you can save up. This is why the ride model exists. Not because operators are greedy, because the arithmetic is brutal. A single overhaul cycle can consume an entire season of ride revenue. The seats are not profit. The seats are the engine fund, collected $400 at a time from strangers on weekends for years. Every person who has ever paid to sit in one of these aircraft has, without knowing it, bought a small piece of a cylinder. And the passengers who understand that tend to become the best supporters this world has. They come back, they join as members, they bring their children, and later their grandchildren. Operators will tell you the ride is not really the product at all. The ride is recruitment. A man who has felt 4 radials shake the airframe on a takeoff roll will write a check 20 years later. And that check is what keeps the aeroplane airworthy long after the $400 is spent. The ledger. Let's lay out the whole cost sheet, because the engines are only the headline. Fuel, hundreds of gallons an hour, every hour, at aviation prices. Oil, which on large radial engines is consumed in a way modern pilots find alarming. These engines use oil as a matter of design, not as a fault. Scheduled inspections, which for an aircraft this old and this large are a serious annual undertaking, often taking the aircraft out of service for weeks. Insurance, and this one is worth pausing on. Insuring a rare, irreplaceable aircraft that carries members of the public is not a normal transaction. There are few underwriters willing to write it, no real comparables to price against, and the premium reflects both the value of the hull and the liability of the passengers. When conditions in that market change, they change hard, and the operator has no alternative supplier to run to. Hang garage. Because leaving a bomber outdoors is how you turn a flying aircraft into a corrosion project. Parts, fabrication, ongoing, forever. Every year, some component becomes unobtainable and has to be manufactured. Crew currency and training, which costs money even when the volunteers are unpaid. And ferry costs, which people always forget. Getting the aircraft to an airshow means flying it there, which means burning the fuel and the engine hours to reach the place where you will earn the money. The bomber pays to go to work. Add it together and you get a machine whose annual operating cost runs into the hundreds of thousands of dollars before anything breaks unexpectedly, which it will. The trap. Now the trap. And it is not the one people expect. The obvious trap is the project airframe. Buy the cheap Hulk, discover the 10-year restoration, run out of money at year 6, sell the parts. That happens constantly, and it is genuinely brutal. But the real trap in the bomber world is different, and it is structural. Your entire business model rests on a permission slip. Everything we just described, the rides, the fund, the maintenance, the survival of the aircraft, depends on being allowed to carry paying passengers under that historic aircraft exemption. That permission is conditional. It can be tightened, it can be suspended, it can be reviewed after something goes wrong, anywhere in the fleet, involving an aircraft you have never touched. And here is the cruel part. You can be the most careful operator in the world, with immaculate maintenance and a spotless record, and still lose your revenue because of what happened to somebody else's aircraft on the other side of the country. That is not a hypothetical. It is the story of the last few years in this market. When the model broke, 2 accidents reshaped this world, and both deserve to be talked about carefully because people died in them. In October of 2019, a B-17 operated by a well-known foundation crashed shortly after takeoff in Connecticut during a living history flight. 7 people lost their lives. The aircraft was destroyed. The consequences went far beyond one operator. The foundation's authorization to carry passengers was pulled. Regulators and investigators examined the entire framework that allowed paying passengers on aircraft like this. Every operator in the country suddenly found their core revenue model under scrutiny, and the industry spent a long period unsure whether it would survive in its existing form at all. Then, in November of 2022, at an air show in Dallas, a B-17 and a smaller fighter collided in mid-air during a formation display. 6 people were killed. It happened in front of thousands of spectators and was filmed from a dozen angles. 2 of the world's small number of flying heavy bombers were gone in 3 years, along with 13 lives. I want to be careful here, because this is not a story about blame. Investigations examined both events in detail, and the findings are public. What matters for this ledger is the economic consequence, which was severe and permanent. Insurance costs rose. Regulatory scrutiny intensified. Airshow display rules were re-examined. Operators reviewed their own procedures. And every foundation flying a heavy bomber had to answer a question it had never really had to answer before. Is this model sustainable? And at what cost? The answer, for the survivors, has been yes, but differently. What changed in practice was visible within a season. Formation displays were reconsidered. Briefings got longer. Some operators quietly reduced how many passengers they carry, or where those passengers sit, or which airports they will operate from. Ride prices moved upward, not out of opportunism, but because insurance and compliance costs moved first. And a community that had always been proud of its safety record started talking about it far more openly. Because the alternative was watching the permission slip disappear for everybody. More conservative operations, more stringent training, higher costs passed through to ride prices, and a much clearer understanding across the whole community that the permission slip is not permanent and the fleet is not replaceable. When there are fewer than 10 of something flying on the entire planet, losing 2 is not an accident statistic. It is 20% of the world. How the survivors do it. So who is still flying and how? First, and almost universally, they are not individuals. The bombers that fly today are held by foundations, museums, and membership organizations. That structure matters enormously. It brings donations, it brings volunteer labor, it brings tax treatment that individuals cannot access, and it spreads the risk across a board rather than one person's bank account. Second, they run diversified revenue. Rides, plus air shows, plus tours, plus memberships, plus a gift shop, plus corporate sponsorship. The operations that leaned entirely on ride income were the most exposed when that income was interrupted. Third, they fund the engines before they fund anything else. The disciplined operators treat the overhaul reserve the way a battleship museum treats the dry dock fund. Money goes into it from every ticket, every season, whether or not an engine is currently due. The ones who spend the reserve on paint find out later what that costs. Fourth, they build the crew pipeline deliberately. Training the next generation of people who can fly and maintain these aircraft is not a side project. It is succession planning for the aircraft itself. And fifth, they treat safety as an economic asset, not a compliance cost. After the last few years, every operator in this world understands that the whole fleet's ability to earn depends on the whole fleet's record. Your safety culture protects somebody else's aeroplane too. The verdict. So, should you own a bomber? Realistically, you personally will not. Almost nobody does. And that is the honest answer this format owes you. But the reason is interesting. It is not that the aircraft is unaffordable to buy, although it very nearly is. It is that a heavy bomber cannot be owned passively. A tank can sit. A submarine can sit. Expensively, but it can sit. A bomber that sits becomes a corrosion problem and then a parts source. And within a few years, it is not a bomber anymore. To keep it airworthy, you need a crew, a maintenance organization, a hangar, a reserve fund, an insurance policy almost nobody will write, and a permission slip from a regulator that can be withdrawn. That is not ownership. That is running a small airline with one very old aeroplane and no scheduled service. Here is the good year. The exemption holds. The season books out. Ride seats sell across a full summer. The airshow circuit pays its fees. The tour packs local airports. A sponsor renews. And the engine reserve grows faster than the engines wear. The aircraft flies, the volunteers stay, and a few thousand people stand on a ramp and hear 4 radials start up in sequence for the first time in their lives. And here is the bad year. An engine goes early. The insurance renewal arrives higher than the whole ride program cleared. A crash somewhere else in the country tightens the rules for everybody. Weather kills 3 tour stops in a row. 2 key volunteers retire in the same winter. And a machine that needs to fly to survive spends a season in a hangar, quietly getting older. Same aeroplane, same history. The difference is a reserve fund and a regulatory decision made by somebody who has never seen it, which is the strangest thing about this asset, and it is where we finish. Thesis: close. Every other machine in this series can be owned in the ordinary sense. You buy it, you park it, you pay to maintain it, and if you stop, it waits for you. A bomber does not wait. It was built to fly. It survives only by flying. And every hour in the air is the thing keeping it alive and the thing consuming it. The people who keep these aircraft in the sky are not owners. They are a supply chain, a training school, a charity, and a maintenance organization wrapped around 80-year-old aluminium that a factory expected to be scrapped by 1946. Nobody owns a bomber. They just take a turn keeping it in the air.